Welcome to episode 20 of the reading of Michael McCoy's Garden. Well, in fact, we're not going to do any reading at all today. I thought it might be fun to just look at some of the books that I've mentioned that were really influential to me at the time and that really had implanted visions and dreams in my head about the way I wanted my own garden to look. One of the most influential books was this one, Bold Romantic Gardens by James Van Sweden and Wolfgang Oehme. And James Van Sweden and Wolfgang Oehme, or James Van Sweden himself, came in 1989 to Melbourne, and we were all just so blown away by the images of the gardens that we saw. And I'll show you a little bit of the kind of thing that we were seeing and just how totally different it was from the kind of English-based gardening that we'd otherwise been looking at. So you can see there this kind of amazing mix of perennials in a very naturalistic kind of setting. And here's a bit of planting around a swimming pool. Now, we'd seen nothing like this. I'll just hold it still for a bit there. We'd seen nothing like this before that date in October 1989. And it changed everything for me. It was like perennials had escaped from the border and become plants of ground cover, of great big, massive planar effects over which your eye just kind of skimmed. And this was completely different to the kind of presentation that you expect from a herbaceous border, which is all about standing on a lawn or on some paving and looking at plants presented to you in graded heights. It's entirely different. So that really shaped my understanding. Now, interestingly, since then, a lot has changed. This was the first type of planting of perennials en masse that I'd ever seen. And there's been a lot of work in this sense since, and particularly and very famously by Piet Oudolf in the Netherlands, but mostly working and I'd say most of his most influential work is outside of the Netherlands, in Britain and in America. But this was the first insight I had into that kind of planting. It's very blocky compared to what you see Oudolf do, which is very fuzzy and intermingled. And there's this fantastic ongoing debate about when using perennials whether they should be clumped or intermingled. And people fall into one camp or the other. This is very much in the clump camp, and it was very much what I was experimenting with at the time. So I wanted to play with a little bit of that kind of thinking. And the other really influential person, not yet book, but the other influential thinking was that of Beth Chatto. I'd been to see her gravel garden in 1994. She dug up an old car park in her nursery in sometime around 1992, sometime around then, and cultivated it, deep ripped it, with the intention of doing this dry garden. So absolutely never watered in a very dry part of Essex, where I think the average rainfall at the time was something like 16 or 18 inches a year, maybe less. But over the years that she created this garden, I interviewed her for my radio show on the ABC at the time. Over those years, her rainfall was no more than 12 to 14 inches, so incredibly dry and quite hot by English standards. So she wanted to do something very Mediterranean. And when I went to visit it with Christopher Lloyd in 1994, Christopher Lloyd and Fergus Garrett and I drove up from Dixter to see the garden and visit Beth. Christo and Beth Chatto were really great friends, and so I was really pleased to be part of the gang. And I was just blown away by this planting. And I can't quite figure out what it was that to me was just so revolutionary. It changed everything. It was very different even to what Beth's own planting had been in the rest of the garden. And the rest of the garden is very much these kind of snaky lawns, actually big amoeboid garden beds, amongst which the infill is lawn. So you're kind of winding through this very informal garden of great big deep beds and these lawns that kind of wiggled and sinuously inveigled themselves in amongst these planted beds. But it was always a very clear separation between the lawn and then the garden bed. The lawn was really nice, mostly really nicely looked after, or most of the times when I saw it was green. So very much this traditional, very much more a traditional idea of plant presentation. The gravel garden, it was not an original idea of Beth's. In fact, I'd seen one some years earlier at Denman's by John Brooks, and there are records of earlier types of planting like this. But this was the first that I'd really got to see up close and personal, or in a way that really shifted my understanding. And I think the thing that was most influential to me was the idea of graveling over the paths as well as all the garden beds, as if the plants have come up in gravel, as if the gravel is actually the natural surface, and that the plants have been established themselves, self-sown, and the paths are just where animals or we as humans might walk through. And the reason why this is just so different is there is no separation between the garden bed and the path, and it means that plants can be in places quite dense, as they are in the wild often, but in really harsh environments, plants often become really quite sparse. So in this case, you can have plants becoming really spangled and sparse as they merge towards the path systems. And there is no need for a clean edge between the two, an interface between the two, between the path and the garden bed. And the surface of the path just winds underneath these plants, and there's no actual bare soil exposed. And what this allows in terms of growing low plants and presenting plants in isolation in gravel, gradually becoming denser and intermingling with one another, just changes everything about the way you present plants. But it also means that as you walk in amongst these paths, that you have an entirely different sense of being immersed in them. That at times you're quite distant from the height, and other times you wiggle kind of right in amongst height. And you're looking at this planting from multiple different angles. I was just so excited, but it opened my whole world to a whole new kind of planting. Now, as it turns out, Beth's amazing book, Beth Chatto's Gravel Garden, didn't actually come out until the year 2000, which is the same year that my book came out. So I had not seen that book, and what I was working from was memory of my own visit, taking photos on that day, and some photos taken by friends who'd visited subsequently. And in fact, I think in many ways I fundamentally misunderstood Beth's ideas about soil preparation and minimal intervention. Maybe that's not even quite right, because she did cultivate her soil very, very deeply. But I asked her about all of the compost she added to the soil when I interviewed her in about, I think, 1997. And she said that the compost was there just to create moisture retention in order to get the plants established. And she knew that ultimately they would be running entirely without it, because she wasn't going to keep cultivating the soil, and that would fairly quickly disappear with time. And so when I spoke to her on the radio show, which was about 5 years after the original planting, she said to me that none of that compost would actually remain. It would all be gone. But by then, the Mediterranean shrubs and trees that she was using had established themselves and didn't need the moisture retention. It's really important to understand that in adding the compost, she was not trying to add nutrition to the soil, that she was actually trying to keep the nutrient levels very low, because that's a kind of fundamental a basis for planting in this kind of dry, really free-draining soil, is to avoid a big explosion, a peak of growth that then has to be maintained with water. So you are actually building into it a kind of a stress level, a slowness of response time. But she knew that without the assistance of a bit of moisture retention, that very few of these plants would become established effectively in her own garden. In order to ultimately be able to cope with the lack of water that was going to be inflicted upon them. she didn't water at all, having watered plants in. But I should show you some photos in her garden, the kind of things that really inspired me. I mean, you see this, and for those of you who know my book, will immediately see the likeness, or see that, be somewhat familiar with what you're seeing there. I mean, my planting was nowhere near as sophisticated as hers. Obviously, I didn't have the plant palette nor the plant knowledge to be able to do this kind of thing at the time. But it was very, very much an inspiration to me. Neither of these kind of styles had been explored much in Australia at the time, and I was really keen to give them a go in my own garden. And so in the next few episodes of this reading, I'll talk a bit about establishing those plantings and really all the kind of uncertainties of that, but for me, the experimental fun, knowing that failure was always a possibility, but the fun of committing this to be open to the public. In, I think now in the reading, we're up to about 45 or something weeks left to go. And so I was very much on the countdown. So join me for tomorrow's episode. Bye.